I literally pulled this car out of a field. The story behind it is that my dad's really into building hot rods and restoring muscle cars too. That's where I get it from. And he had bought this car for parts. He bought two. He has one that's in much better shape that he's gonna restore. Make it like a car that he had when he first got his license. The parts car that was left over, I was able to buy it off of him for about the same price that I sold my 240. Pretty good deal, right? Now why I chose an El Camino chassis? Like I said before, my dad had one when he first got his license. And when I was 13, the very first car that I got was a Chevy El Camino. It was the G-body, the newer generation of this, but still made its place in my heart. It's a car that I've loved for my entire life, and I've dreamt of doing a build like this since I was probably 4 or 5 years old. That's why El Camino. And why make it a drift car with a C4 Corvette suspension? Story on the Corvette suspension was I initially bought it for my Acadian and then decided to go a different route with it. So I had the leftover parts that I once tried to sell, but they never sold, so I just figured I'd hang on to them in case a situation like this would arise. I like to think that I grew up at a really good time of the automotive evolution industry kind of deal. I'm old enough to understand, love, and appreciate the hot rodders, the old school muscle cars. I'm also young enough to have grown up during the evolution of the import craze, the start of drifting, and all the fun stuff like that. So why not combine all those worlds into one crazy beast of a car that's gonna look cool and be completely different? This is my Chevy El Camino drift build.
Fucking rules. Said it can't be done, but our time has come. We play with fire and burn.
So I took possession of the chassis, the El Camino, at about the end of July and started gathering all my parts. I went through in the back, and we live on a big farmland, so we got storage kind of like just scattered junkyard style. I had some stuff stashed out in the back.
Leftovers in this kind of junkyard deal thing. Might need some help to dig that out in my truck. It's over there. But everything will have its day.
Covered from the elements. Went there, started collecting all my parts, seeing what I had, and it turns out that over the years of playing with these cars and drifting and doing other motorsports and stuff like that, I always seem to hang on to bits and pieces of things. So now I pretty much have the complete setup I need. I've got motor, trans, wiring harness, ECU, some pretty wild stuff, some very high performance stuff. I'm gonna need to get a fuel cell and a couple lines and stuff like that, but the suspension that I had put on this thing has full brakes and everything. Good to go, ready to rock and roll. So it was just a question of gathering all the stuff and making a plan and getting to work.
You'll never have the sacred stone.
Oh, crazy mother.
I got the El Camino in the shop and started cleaning it up, investigating further what I'm up against, and realized that there's really a lot of parts of this thing that are gonna have to be chopped off. The floors were pretty much finished, parts of the fenders, parts of the wheel wells, parts of the bed. Most of it's gotta go, and I'm building a race car, so it doesn't really matter how much of it goes. It's gotta go and make room for everything I have to put into it. The roll cage, the race seats, safety equipment, new motor, new trans. And I had a crazy plan of moving the engine back a couple inches to hopefully match the weight balance distribution geometry of the Corvette a little bit, since I'm running a C4 Corvette suspension. And that's aluminum A-arms up front, rack and pinion steering, much lighter than the stock stuff that was on this El Camino, which was pretty crazy. The steering box that had like 2.5 turns locked from center to lock. And the back end of this thing, I got rid of the straight differential and those drum brakes, all that heavy setup, and put in a full aluminum independent rear suspension, which is also from the C4 Corvette. can't be beat. It looks good. It should perform really well, and I just hope it balances itself out and everything works out to perform at its maximum potential. Now, step number one, I did the front suspension because I assumed that would be the hardest one to do, where I have to get all the geometry right. I have to get everything lined up properly, squared off, corner to corner, do all the good measurements. And I had to make the chassis I had to massage the metal a bit. The suspension, the whole subframe, everything fit in between the frame rails on the El Camino, but I had to chop the inside and bring it in about 1/2 inch on each side because the subframe of the Corvette actually has a bit of a taper on the pieces that hold your upper A-arms. To make it sit, to cradle it properly, I had to take a little bit off the bottom to make the car sit as low as I wanted it to sit, and on the outside, I had to eliminate the big cups that were in the frame that held the stock springs in place. Because the Corvette suspension is based on a graphite kind of fiberglass leaf spring, and it's got just shocks in it, no more big coil springs, so that had to be eliminated, make room for everything else. I had to make room for the A-arms to clear and make sure it all aligned. So that was the hardest part, I assumed. When the front was done, I got it to sit on the ground. I put some toe straps on it that would simulate the suspension sitting lower with the weight of the engine. It sits nice, it looks good, it tucks kind of how I want. And the best part of it is it's not too low that it should perform good. And if I do want to go lower, they sell drop spindles for that suspension, and I can go up to a 3-inch, or down to a 3-inch drop, which will be pretty significant, I think. Gonna have an issue maybe with the oil pan clearing later on. Now the front's all in, everything's dialed, I got to move on to the back. Now I assumed the back would be easy because I measured the Corvette suspension and its mounting points sit in between the frame rails. So I have nothing in the way, I thought. I made brackets, put it all in, made it fit. First time around, I actually had it too far back. I mismeasured on the inside of the fenders and on the frame where it would sit. I ended up with the back wheel sitting way too far back. It looked horrible, so I figured, okay, can't accept that, can't accept almost okay. It's gotta be to the way I envisioned it, the way I want it. So I chopped those off and moved it forward, got it to sit in the right place, welded the new brackets in, did all that fun stuff, got in the back of the truck, jumped on it, and realized that the frame, because it sits wider than the mounting points of the Corvette suspension, when the suspension compresses, the calipers and the mounts for the sway bars, everything runs directly into the stock frame of the El Camino, which gave me maybe 1.5 inches of travel, and that would just be disaster. So once again, can't accept subpar. It's got to be perfect to the way I want it, the way I envisioned it. My only solution around this now is to build my own section of frame. So I've never done a modification like this to a car, actually cutting the frame off and building my own pieces and putting it together as one whole piece together and making it function. But I am lucky enough to have witnessed my dad do it to Corvettes or other muscle cars that he was building, and I had a pretty good idea where to go. So I started getting to work, made a plan, measured 100 times, made sure everything was right. It was kind of tricky because I had to measure angles and heights and distances to make sure it all fit in. Fortunately enough, the way I built it, it sort of slid into the stock frame where I had cut the stock frame off, so everything was lining up nicely. They fit pretty good, but I've got to shorten this, I've got to get rid of these, I've got to clean everything up, make a good surface to weld to. I've got to cut these down a little bit. And the idea is, you can see here, this is the new piece of frame, comes down like this, it's going to go off that way, this one's going to go off that way. I had to weld that whole frame section in, get the diff to sit in there properly with all the mounts. The tricky part on this one was doing ladder bars, because that was also another problem that I had on the stock frame, was the ladder bars lined up right inside the frame. So I would have to chop out way too much and sacrifice way too much strength to make that work properly. And on this one, the frame sits narrow enough that the ladder bars sit on the outside just like a Corvette does. And I made some plates and I designed it so that I could have some sort of measurement, so I could pull the front wheels in forward, or I can push them back a little bit by just using spacers, maybe some washers on the mounting points of the ladder bars themselves. The rear end was complete. The whole El Camino is back on the ground, a rolling chassis. I called the boys that came over and helped me put the motor and trans in to see where everything's gonna fit and where everything was gonna go. So we put the motor in, measured it up, figured out that we're gonna have to cut the firewall big time and the floors to get the transmission, everything to fit the way it should. The motor is gonna sit a little higher than stock in the stock chassis, but that gives me all kinds of clearance below so that I don't have to worry about the transmission hitting the drive shaft, dragging on the ground or anything like that. The drive shaft's actually gonna sit above the floor, which means I had to cut out pretty much the entire floor. Most of it was rotten, so no big deal. It was gonna have to go anyway, and I have to make new floors now or buy new ones. I'm gonna make my own floors so I can get it to sit as low as I can, because I'm a tall guy and I want a lot of headroom in there. I want space inside this car because that's been an issue my whole life, is building race cars with roll cages, having a hard time getting in them, feeling too tight in there, hitting my head on the bars. Not cool. With the trans tunnel cut out, the firewall cut out, that brings us up to date in the videos now. So welcome back to the Drift El Camino build. Let's start chopping into this thing some more, make a bit more room for what I need to do next. From here, I figured I needed a lot more room to work around this engine since I'm moving it back so far. And I want room that I can actually work on it when it's all together. I'm gonna make it so that parts come off of it. I can access different parts of the transmission, drive shaft, the yokes or universal joints, whatever I may need to get to. But I need room as much as possible. So pretty much this entire firewall's gotta go. I gotta take the engine and everything back out, make some room to work, and get to cutting. I had previously only cut the floor out enough to get the transmission tunnel out of the way so we could slide the motor and trans into it, see where it might sit, and then make sure that it had enough room. So now I'm gonna cut the rest of the floor pans out because they're mostly rotten and chopped up already as it is. It's not worth keeping them, and for what I have in mind, I'm gonna need a lot of space to make my own floor so I can sit properly in this. I'm pretty tall, I need a lot of room for my head.
Clean it up and now I can put brand new pretty stuff and a brand new. Over here, just putting everything in kind of loose for the time being, just so I can make.
When the floor pans were gone and I had room to work around that, the next step was getting into the firewall and making that extra wide so I could get the engine to sit inside and it not look completely horrible. As I progress, I'm probably going to cut more into it, but for now I just got to make sure I have room to get in there, everything clears and everything potentially looks good or could look good when I'm done putting it all together.
I'll let the video keep rolling, but this is the moment that I should have realized we're gonna
These were some tricky angles to work on, so if you're going to attempt this, make sure you have the proper guards and everything in place because you don't want your grinding wheel blowing up and smashing your face to bits because you're trying to get it in a weird spot and it twisted funny. Write that down. Getting rid of the upper firewall was a bit of a challenge, but now that it's a big gaping hole and it's all open, it's all been destroyed and ripped apart, I finally have room to move forward and get done what I need to do.
Furniture auctions in California when I was like 8. Really? Yeah, I'd go to like Stater Brothers, I'd buy hot dogs, I'd buy crop tops.
that much room inside, all it was left to do really was measure up everything and start creating a game plan for how I'm gonna make it all fit together. Like I said, it's a pretty big motor transmission that's back about 8 inches, so I've got to make sure that the firewall, the transmission tunnel, and everything clears the engine properly. I can seal it up so it's safe from fires, that's what it's for, and enough that it keeps the smoke out of the cab so I can see where I'm going when I'm at full drift and blowing a lot of smoke out the back end. And also I wanted to make sure that when it's all together, I can easily work on it, because if we're at the track or something like that, I want to be able to get in there and change any part that I might need to change or check anything with a little bit of extra work as possible. So I want to make sure that the firewall is back far enough, it's open enough, the transmission tunnel is big enough that I can get in there when I need, and I have a lot of room for clearance while not making it too weird looking. And I also want to have it so that I can just access parts of it and get to what I need to. So I'm gonna have some probably panels that come off. It's pretty big mock-up plan, pretty big, like I'm not sure how it's gonna work out, but that's the plan for it. So it's about measuring a lot, writing everything down, figuring stuff out, and then just keep moving on forward. Next video, we're making motor mounts and transmission mounts. Gonna get that engine to sit in there properly, and we have to make everything from scratch. So it's gonna be quite the adventure. See you next week.